Most people think disrespect begins with a loud insult, a raised voice, or some obvious act of hostility that everyone in the room can clearly see. But that is not how it actually works in the real world of human power. Disrespect usually begins quietly, almost invisibly, in moments so small that most people dismiss them without a second thought. A colleague interrupts you mid-sentence and continues talking as if nothing happened. A friend makes a subtle joke at your expense in front of others, smiling just enough to make it seem harmless. Someone ignores a boundary you politely expressed, then acts surprised when you bring it up again. These moments feel insignificant on the surface, yet they carry a message beneath the words. The message is simple. They are testing you. Listen carefully. Disrespect is rarely an explosion. It is a probe, a quiet measurement of how far someone can step into your space before you react. Think about it. When someone crosses a line with you, they are not only watching your reaction in that moment, they are observing something much more valuable. Your pattern, your emotional reflex, your tolerance for discomfort. And once they see the pattern, they begin adjusting their behavior accordingly. Most people never notice this. They think respect is something granted by personality, kindness, or good intentions. They believe that if they are polite, reasonable, and calm, others will automatically treat them the same way. Lie. The truth is that respect is rarely given because someone deserves it. Respect is given because people sense that certain lines cannot be crossed without consequence. Notice the difference. Not aggression, not anger, consequence. Now here is where most people fall into the trap. When someone disrespects them, their first instinct is emotional correction. They try to explain why the behavior was wrong. They defend themselves. They justify their feelings. They appeal to fairness. Think about the last time someone subtly dismissed you in a conversation. Maybe they interrupted you repeatedly while speaking over your point. Maybe they rolled their eyes when you spoke in a meeting. What did you do? Most people react by trying to regain approval. They speak more carefully. They soften their tone. They attempt to appear reasonable so that the other person understands they are not a threat. They try to maintain harmony. That is the trap. Because the moment you begin defending your dignity, you quietly hand control of the situation to the other person. Here is the brutal truth. In social dynamics, explanations often weaken your position more than silence ever will. Imagine a simpler situation. You are in a group discussion at work. You share an idea. Someone immediately dismisses it with a casual remark. Something like, "That wouldn't work." No explanation, just dismissal. The room moves on. Most people feel an instant urge to prove themselves. They begin explaining the logic of their idea, adding more context, trying to convince the group they deserve to be heard. But something strange happens in that moment. The more you explain, the more the social dynamic shifts. Suddenly, you are no longer presenting an idea. You are defending your credibility. And once you enter that frame, the power has already moved. Think about it carefully. The person who dismissed your idea did not need evidence. They simply made a declaration. You responded with justification. In the eyes of the group, something subtle occurs. The person making the declaration appears confident. The person defending appears uncertain. Even if your idea is correct, the social impression has already formed. That is how disrespect grows, not through loud confrontation, but through small shifts in perception. You felt it, didn't you? That uncomfortable moment where you realize someone has quietly lowered your position in a conversation. Most people respond by pushing harder. They try to correct the misunderstanding. They try to reclaim the space they lost. But social hierarchy rarely works that way. When someone tests your boundary and you respond by negotiating your dignity, the test is passed, not by you, by them. Now watch what happens when someone understands the real mechanism. When a person who understands power experiences subtle disrespect, they rarely react the way others expect. They do not rush to explain themselves. They do not raise their voice. They do not even appear offended. Instead, they do something far more unsettling. They withdraw attention. This sounds simple, almost passive, but it changes the entire dynamic. Attention is one of the most valuable currencies in human interaction. Most people are constantly competing for it without realizing it. When someone dismisses you and you immediately chase validation, you reward the behavior with more attention. You show them that their small act of disrespect has the power to control your emotional focus. But when you remove attention calmly, without explanation, something interesting begins to happen. The person who attempted the test suddenly loses the feedback they were expecting. Think about a conversation where someone makes a sarcastic remark about you in front of others. Most people respond defensively. They correct the statement. They laugh nervously. They try to show they are not affected. But imagine a different response. You simply pause. Look at them for a brief moment. Then shift your attention back to the conversation as if the remark did not deserve acknowledgement. No argument, no explanation, no emotional reaction. Just absence. Most people cannot tolerate this silence because disrespect relies on engagement. It needs your reaction to continue existing. Without it, the moment becomes uncomfortable for the person who initiated it. They expected friction. They expected defense. Instead, they receive indifference. And indifference has a strange psychological effect. It makes people question their own move. Now, be careful. This is not the same as pretending nothing happened. It is something far more controlled. It is the deliberate refusal to participate in a frame that lowers your position. Here is the brutal part. Many people who disrespect others are not consciously malicious. They are simply responding to signals in the environment. They notice who defends themselves constantly. They notice who apologizes quickly. They notice who bends under pressure. And once they detect those signals, they adjust their behavior accordingly. That is how subtle hierarchies form in everyday life. In friend groups, in offices, in relationships. Someone becomes the person whose time is always negotiable. Someone becomes the person whose opinions are easily dismissed. Someone becomes the person others interrupt without hesitation. Not because they lack intelligence or value, but because their reactions trained others to treat them that way. Think about the quiet patterns around you. There is always someone in the group who is rarely interrupted. Someone whose words are given space automatically. Someone whose presence changes the tone of the conversation. It is rarely the loudest person. Often it is the calmest one. Because people sense that crossing certain lines with that person will not produce emotional chaos. It will produce distance. And distance is expensive. When someone who holds social value withdraws attention, access, or engagement, the environment shifts. Others begin adjusting their behavior to restore balance. But when someone who constantly seeks approval withdraws, nothing changes. The group simply moves on. This is the difference most people never learn. Respect is not protected by arguments. It is protected by limits. Limits that are expressed through behavior, not speeches. Imagine another situation. A friend repeatedly cancels plans with you at the last minute. Each time they apologize with a quick excuse. Most people respond with understanding. They say it is fine. They accommodate the behavior. They explain that they know life is busy. Over time, something subtle happens. Your time becomes flexible in their mind. You become the person whose plans can always move. Not because they dislike you, because you allowed the pattern. Now imagine a different reaction. The next time the same cancellation occurs, you respond politely but briefly. No emotional lecture, no resentment, simply a shift. You stop prioritizing plans with that person. Your availability becomes limited. Your energy moves elsewhere. No drama, just consequence. At first, they may not notice, but eventually the pattern reveals itself. Suddenly they must invest more effort to maintain the connection. Suddenly your time is no longer guaranteed. That is how boundaries quietly reshape relationships. Not through confrontation, through adjustment. Be careful. Though, Many people misunderstand this idea and try to imitate it in a theatrical way. They attempt to appear indifferent while secretly hoping the other person notices their performance. That does not work, because real indifference cannot be faked. It comes from an internal decision about what deserves your energy. And this is where psychological strength becomes visible. Most people react to disrespect because their identity feels threatened. When someone dismisses them, they feel the urge to restore their image immediately. They cannot tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood. They need correction now. But the person who understands power does something different. They allow the misunderstanding to exist temporarily. Think about that. They do not rush to repair every false impression. They do not chase every opportunity to prove themselves. They understand something most people ignore. Social perception stabilizes over time. One small moment does not define your position. Your pattern does. So instead of reacting to every slight, they choose their moments carefully. They observe who is testing boundaries repeatedly. They observe who respects limits once they are established. They notice which environments reward quiet strength and which reward constant self-defense. And then they make adjustments. Sometimes the adjustment is distance. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is a single calm sentence delivered at the right moment, but never frantic explanation. Because frantic explanation signals vulnerability. Listen carefully. The goal is not to eliminate every act of disrespect in your life. That is impossible. Human beings constantly test each other's boundaries, often without realizing it. The real goal is to prevent those tests from becoming patterns that define your position. And that requires one uncomfortable skill: emotional restraint. Not suppression, control. The ability to feel irritation, frustration, even anger, and still choose a response that strengthens your position rather than weakens it. Most people cannot do this. The moment they feel slighted, they react immediately. They text a long message explaining how they feel. They confront the person aggressively. They demand acknowledgement. But that reaction often produces the opposite of what they want. Instead of restoring respect, it exposes how easily their emotions can be triggered. And once someone learns how to trigger you, they hold a small lever over your behavior. Now consider the alternative. When someone makes a dismissive remark toward you, you pause. You let the moment pass. You continue speaking with the same calm tone you had before. You do not accelerate your explanation. You do not justify your presence. You simply continue as if your position in the room was never in question. At first, this may feel unnatural. Your mind will tell you that silence looks weak, that ignoring the moment means you are allowing the disrespect to stand. But social psychology reveals something interesting. People judge confidence less by what you say and more by what you refuse to react to. If every small challenge provokes a response, others learn that your equilibrium is fragile. But if challenges pass through the room without disturbing your composure, people begin to treat you differently. They become more careful. Not because you demanded respect, because they sensed it was already present. This does not mean you never confront anyone. That would be another mistake. There are moments when clarity must be delivered directly, but those moments are chosen deliberately, not emotionally. They occur after patterns become visible, not during the first sign of friction. And when they occur, the tone is calm, almost quiet. Something like this: "I noticed this has happened several times. That won't work for me." No anger, no speech, no debate. Just a line. And once that line is spoken, the real test begins. Because now, you must enforce it. Most people fail at this step. They state boundaries but abandon them the moment the other person pushes back. They say no, then soften it with explanations. They say they are unavailable, then rearrange their schedule to avoid conflict. In doing so, they teach others a simple lesson. Your limits are negotiable. But when someone states a boundary and calmly holds it, the environment begins adjusting around them. Some people will respect the line immediately. Others will attempt to test it again, hoping the previous response was temporary. And this is where patience becomes power. Because true boundaries are not proven in the moment they are spoken. They are proven in the moments that follow. When the same pressure returns and the same line remains standing, and slowly, without argument, people learn that certain doors around you simply do not open anymore, which leads to the uncomfortable realization most people eventually face. Not everyone will stay in your life once your boundaries become clear. Some relationships were built entirely on access to your patience, your flexibility, your emotional labor. When that access disappears, the connection loses its foundation. At first, this can feel like loss. You may wonder if you were too cold, too distant, too rigid. But here is the deeper truth. Many relationships survive only because one person tolerates behavior that should never have become normal. Once that tolerance ends, the illusion disappears, and the silence that follows can feel heavy. But inside that silence, something else begins forming. A different reputation, a quieter one that does not require constant defense. And if you observe closely, you will notice something subtle beginning to change around you. The same people who once interrupted you begin waiting for you to finish speaking. The same people who once joked at your expense become slightly more careful with their words. Invitations become clearer. Conversations become more balanced. Not everywhere, not with everyone, but in the places where it matters. Because social systems adjust slowly, almost like water finding a new level. When someone changes the way they respond to pressure, the environment gradually reorganizes itself around that new signal. It does not happen instantly. It happens through repetition, moment by moment, test by test. And the people watching you, even the ones who say nothing, are learning exactly where you stand. Which brings us to the part most people struggle with the most. The moment when someone attempts to publicly lower your status. Perhaps it happens in a meeting, when someone mocks your suggestion with a sarcastic tone. Perhaps it happens in a group conversation where someone subtly frames you as inexperienced, naive, or overly sensitive. These moments carry higher stakes because they occur in front of others. Your reaction will shape not only your relationship with that person, but the perception of everyone observing the interaction. And this is where the instinct to defend yourself becomes strongest. Your mind tells you that silence will make you appear weak. But the truth is more complicated than that. Because the most powerful response is rarely the loudest one. Often, it is the calmest interruption possible. A single sentence delivered with absolute composure. Something like this. That's an interesting assumption. Then pause. Silence. And let the room breathe for a moment before continuing. That pause changes the energy of the interaction. Instead of chasing the insult, you reframed it. Instead of defending yourself, you exposed the other person's move as an assumption. Now the room begins evaluating their comment rather than your reaction. This subtle shift can completely reverse the dynamic, but only if it is delivered without emotional tension. If your voice carries anger, the effect disappears. The moment becomes conflict. People focus on the clash instead of the structure of the remark. But when the tone remains calm, almost curious, the tension moves onto the person who initiated the attack. And suddenly, they must explain themselves, which is often the moment they realize the move did not land the way they expected. But there is another layer to this that very few people understand. Sometimes the most strategic response is to do nothing at all. Not because you are afraid, but because the environment itself will correct the behavior. Think about the social patterns in any group. There are individuals who constantly attempt to dominate conversations, mock others, or push boundaries for attention. At first, these people often appear confident, but over time, something else begins to happen. Their behavior becomes predictable. And once behavior becomes predictable, people begin adjusting their perception. What once seemed bold starts to look insecure. What once seemed humorous begins to feel repetitive. The group quietly recalibrates. But this recalibration only occurs if others do not feed the pattern with emotional reactions. So sometimes the most strategic move is patience. Watching, allowing patterns to reveal themselves fully. Because once a pattern becomes obvious, it destroys its own credibility. And in that moment, your silence becomes far more powerful than any argument could have been. But patience requires something most people lack. Confidence in time. Confidence that your position does not depend on winning every moment immediately. Confidence that your reputation is built through consistent behavior rather than quick victories. This confidence cannot be faked. It comes from a simple internal decision. You no longer need everyone's approval. And when that decision becomes real, something unexpected begins to happen. You become harder to provoke, harder to manipulate, harder to move. And once people sense that shift, the tests begin to fade. Not completely, but noticeably, because those who rely on subtle disrespect to gain advantage usually search for easier targets. They look for individuals who react quickly, who explain themselves constantly, who can be pulled into emotional debates. When that pattern disappears from you, the dynamic changes. Slowly, quietly, until one day you notice something strange. The same people who once challenged you casually now choose their words more carefully. Not because you forced them to, because your reactions taught them something. Something simple, something unmistakable. Your dignity is not available for negotiation. And once that message becomes clear, the entire atmosphere around you begins to shift. Which leads to the deeper realization most people eventually discover about disrespect. It is rarely about you. It is about opportunity. When someone senses that a small act of dismissal will go unchallenged, they may take it. When they sense that a joke at your expense will earn laughter without consequence, they may repeat it. When they sense that your time, attention, or patience are endlessly available, they may begin using them freely. Not always maliciously, often automatically, because human behavior follows the path of least resistance. Remove that path, and behavior changes. But here is the final warning. If you decide to adopt this approach, you must accept something uncomfortable. You will become slightly more distant in the eyes of some people. Some will say you changed. Some will say you became colder. Some will say you are harder to approach. They may even frame your boundaries as arrogance or detachment. And that moment is where many people collapse back into their old patterns, because they cannot tolerate being misunderstood. But think carefully. If someone only felt comfortable around you when your boundaries were weak, what exactly were they valuing? Or your compliance? That question often reveals the true structure of many relationships. And once you see that structure clearly, it becomes impossible to return to the old dynamic without noticing the cost. Which brings us to the most important shift in the entire process. The moment you stop trying to control how others interpret your boundaries. Because the truth is, you cannot control that interpretation. Some people will respect it. Some people will resent it. Some people will quietly disappear. And some people will adjust their behavior in ways that surprise you. But none of those reactions change the purpose of the boundary itself. The boundary exists for one reason: to define what kind of treatment you participate in. Nothing more, nothing less. And once that definition becomes clear in your own mind, the way you respond to disrespect begins to transform completely. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through a calm refusal to participate in dynamics that diminish your position. And when that refusal becomes consistent, something remarkable begins to happen. The tests that once appeared everywhere become less frequent. The subtle dismissals begin to vanish. The small jokes at your expense lose their audience. And the people around you begin to sense something that is difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. A quiet line in the sand. A line that does not move. Because once someone truly understands the cost of crossing it, they begin to ask themselves a simple question before speaking. Is it worth it? And in many cases, the answer becomes obvious. But there is still one final situation where this entire philosophy is tested more severely than anywhere else. Not in public, not in professional spaces, but in the quiet territory of personal relationships, because it is there, in the intimate circles of friends, partners, and family, where disrespect often hides behind the most convincing disguises. Because in those close relationships, disrespect rarely appears as open hostility. It hides inside familiarity. It hides inside humor, inside small dismissive comments, inside patterns that slowly grow so normal that nobody questions them anymore. A partner interrupts you repeatedly when you speak, finishing your sentences before you can complete a thought. A friend constantly makes jokes that place you in the role of the overly sensitive one whenever you express discomfort. A family member treats your time as flexible while protecting their own schedule with precision. None of these moments appear dramatic on their own. Yet over time, they accumulate into a pattern that quietly lowers your position. And here is the dangerous part. Because the relationship feels close, most people hesitate to address it directly. They tell themselves the other person means well. They rationalize the behavior as personality differences or stress. They choose patience over clarity. At first, that patience feels like maturity. It feels generous. It feels like emotional intelligence. But if the pattern continues long enough, patience slowly turns into silent permission. Think about how many relationships drift into imbalance this way. Not through conflict, but through avoidance of conflict. One person adapts, the other person becomes accustomed to that adaptation. Over time, the dynamic stabilizes. One speaks more freely, the other chooses words more carefully. One takes space without asking, the other negotiates every inch of it. And eventually something inside you begins to tighten. You notice the imbalance, but you hesitate to confront it because you fear what the confrontation might change. You fear tension. You fear being labeled difficult. You fear disrupting the fragile peace that has formed around the relationship. So you remain quiet. And in that quiet, the pattern deepens. Listen carefully. Disrespect thrives most easily inside silence that pretends to be harmony. Now imagine a different response. Imagine the moment when a familiar pattern appears again. The interruption, the joke at your expense, the dismissal of your preference. Instead of letting the moment pass, you simply pause and address it calmly. Not dramatically, not with a lecture, just a clear observation. Let me finish. 3 words, delivered without irritation. Then you continue speaking. This is not confrontation in the theatrical sense. It is correction, a small adjustment to the dynamic. Yet even this small adjustment can feel uncomfortable if the pattern has existed for years. The other person may react defensively. They may laugh it off. They may accuse you of overreacting. That reaction is not surprising, because when you change your behavior, you also disturb the balance that others became comfortable with. Most people collapse at this stage. They see the discomfort on the other person's face and immediately soften their position. They say something like, "It's okay. I didn't mean it like that." They retreat into explanation, trying to repair the tension they created. But the moment they retreat, the old pattern returns stronger than before. Here is the brutal truth. The first time you enforce a boundary, it will often feel awkward, not because the boundary is wrong, because the environment has not yet adjusted. Boundaries disrupt habits, and habits resist disruption. But if the boundary remains consistent, the resistance eventually fades. The behavior either changes, or the relationship reorganizes around the new reality. Sometimes that reorganization is quiet and gradual. Other times it reveals something uncomfortable. Some people were only comfortable with you when you were easier to manage. Think about it carefully. A person who truly respects you may initially feel surprised when you assert a boundary. but they will adjust. They will observe the new limit and adapt their behavior accordingly. The relationship will stabilize again, often in a healthier form. But someone who relied on your flexibility may respond differently. They may push harder. They may accuse you of changing. They may attempt to frame your boundary as selfishness. This is where clarity becomes essential. Because when someone reacts negatively to a reasonable boundary, they are revealing the structure of the relationship. They are showing you what they valued most about the previous dynamic. And sometimes that realization is uncomfortable. Not because you dislike the person, because you suddenly see the relationship more clearly. Now watch what happens when you remain calm through this process. You do not argue endlessly. You do not justify your decision with long explanations. You simply repeat the boundary through behavior. If the interruption continues, you pause again and say, "Let me finish." If plans are repeatedly changed without consideration, you stop reorganizing your schedule to accommodate them. If jokes at your expense become common, you stop participating in the laughter that surrounds them. At first, these adjustments may appear small, but small adjustments reshape patterns, and patterns reshape relationships. Here is something most people never realize. Respect is rarely established through a single dramatic confrontation. It is established through dozens of quiet moments where a person chooses consistency over comfort. Each moment sends a signal. Each signal accumulates. Eventually, the pattern becomes undeniable. People begin to understand exactly how you respond to certain behaviors. They learn what receives your energy and what does not. And once those signals become clear, the environment begins reorganizing itself around them. But there is another layer to this process that many overlook. Sometimes disrespect is not intentional at all. Sometimes people simply mirror the energy they receive. Think about someone who constantly apologizes for minor things, someone who says sorry before expressing an opinion, or who softens every request with excessive politeness. At first, this behavior appears considerate, but over time it sends a subtle message. It signals uncertainty. It signals that their presence might be an inconvenience. And once that signal becomes familiar, others begin responding accordingly. They interrupt more easily. They dismiss opinions more quickly, not because they consciously decided to disrespect the person, because the person's behavior trained them to treat their presence as negotiable. That is why the way you carry yourself matters far more than most people realize. The tone of your voice when you speak, the pace at which you respond to interruptions, the way you handle small disagreements. All of these signals accumulate into a reputation, not a reputation built from words, but from patterns of behavior that others observe over time. And once that reputation forms, it becomes remarkably stable. People who sense quiet authority in someone rarely test them casually, not because they fear confrontation, but because the signals around that person suggest the test would not produce the reaction they are seeking. Meanwhile, people who sense emotional volatility often provoke them repeatedly, not out of malice, but out of curiosity. Human beings are constantly studying each other, even when they believe they are not, which leads to an uncomfortable realization about disrespect. Sometimes the problem is not the person delivering it. Sometimes the problem is the pattern allowing it to continue. This does not mean you are responsible for every rude comment or dismissive behavior directed toward you. People act according to their own character, but the pattern that follows those moments often depends on how you respond. And if your response consistently prioritizes harmony over clarity, the pattern may continue far longer than it should. Think about the last time someone subtly undermined you in a group conversation. Perhaps they repeated your idea later, as if it were their own. Perhaps they corrected you unnecessarily in front of others. In that moment, you may have chosen silence to avoid tension, and sometimes silence is wise. But if the behavior repeats without adjustment, silence gradually becomes endorsement. The group learns something. They learn that challenging you carries no social cost. And once that lesson is learned, the pattern spreads. Now imagine the same situation handled differently. The person repeats your idea as if it were theirs. Instead of reacting emotionally, You simply smile slightly and say, "Yes, that's the point I mentioned earlier." Then you continue speaking. No accusation, no hostility, just correction. The moment passes quickly, but the signal remains. The group notices. The person who attempted the subtle takeover notices even more. And the next time the opportunity appears, they hesitate slightly before repeating the move. That hesitation is the beginning of change. Be careful, though. This approach requires discipline. If every correction carries irritation or sarcasm, the environment will frame you as combative. But if corrections are delivered calmly and sparingly, they become powerful signals that you are attentive to the dynamics around you. And attentiveness is difficult to manipulate. Now consider another common situation. Someone criticizes you publicly, but the criticism is framed as humor. Perhaps a coworker says something like, "Well, we all know you take forever to make decisions." The room laughs lightly. The comment appears harmless, yet the remark subtly frames you in a negative light. Most people respond with nervous laughter. They play along with the joke, hoping to demonstrate that they are easygoing. But the laughter quietly reinforces the frame. It tells the group the description might be accurate. Instead, imagine a different response. You smile calmly and say, "Only when the decision matters." Then you move on. No anger, no defensive speech, just a reframing. The comment loses its edge immediately. The room senses that the joke did not land the way it was intended, and the person who delivered it learns something important. That kind of framing will not work easily with you. These small moments matter more than people think, because social perception is built from tiny fragments of interaction. One remark here, one pause there, one correction delivered without tension. Each fragment shapes the narrative people form about you, and once that narrative stabilizes, it becomes remarkably difficult to change, which is why the way you handle disrespect early matters so much. Allowing small patterns to grow unchecked often leads to situations where the disrespect becomes deeply embedded. At that point, correcting it requires far more effort. People resist the change because the old dynamic has become comfortable. They expect certain reactions from you. When those reactions disappear, they may experience confusion or frustration. That is normal. Every shift in social structure produces temporary instability, but stability eventually returns, just in a different form. There is another detail most people overlook when learning to handle disrespect: timing. Responding immediately is not always the most effective strategy. Sometimes the better move is delayed clarity. Imagine someone says something dismissive toward you in a fast-paced conversation. The moment passes quickly, and addressing it in that exact second might escalate the situation unnecessarily. Instead, you wait until the interaction slows. Then you calmly say something like, "Earlier you mentioned that my suggestion wouldn't work. I'm curious what specifically you meant." Now the dynamic changes. Instead of defending yourself in the heat of the moment, you invite explanation later. The other person must now articulate the reasoning behind their dismissal. Often, they cannot. The comment was never based on analysis. It was based on impulse. And once the impulse is examined, it loses its authority. The room begins to sense the difference. One person speaks impulsively. The other speaks deliberately. And deliberate speech carries weight. Now here is something many people struggle to accept. Even when you handle disrespect perfectly, some people will still dislike you. Not because you were unfair, because your boundaries remove certain advantages they once enjoyed. This is particularly common in environments where informal hierarchies already exist. If someone built their status partially through subtle dominance of others, your refusal to participate in that dynamic may threaten their position. They may respond with increased criticism or attempts to undermine you indirectly. This is where emotional discipline becomes essential again. Because reacting aggressively to those attempts, they can frame you as volatile or defensive. Instead, you remain consistent, calm, observant. You address clear issues when necessary. but you refuse to participate in endless psychological games. Over time, something interesting happens. Observers begin noticing the contrast. They notice who remains composed during tension. They notice who constantly provokes it. And gradually their perception shifts. What once appeared like confidence in the other person begins to resemble insecurity. Meanwhile, your calm presence becomes associated with stability. That is the quiet power of restraint. It allows patterns to reveal themselves without interference. And once patterns become visible, social judgment often corrects the imbalance naturally. But this process requires patience. It requires the ability to endure moments where the immediate outcome appears uncertain. It requires trusting that consistent behavior will eventually reshape the dynamic even if the change is not immediate. Most people cannot tolerate that uncertainty. They want resolution now. They want respect restored instantly. But social systems rarely move that quickly. They adjust gradually, through repeated signals and observations. Which brings us to a realization that many people find difficult. Handling disrespect effectively is not about controlling other people. It is about controlling yourself, your reactions, your tone, your willingness to engage in certain dynamics. Because once you master those elements, the leverage others hold over you begins to shrink. Their remarks lose power. Their provocations lose momentum. Their attempts to pull you into emotional exchanges fail more often than they succeed. And when those attempts fail repeatedly, people eventually redirect their energy elsewhere. Which means something subtle begins to happen in the spaces around you. The atmosphere becomes calmer, more measured. Because people sense that impulsive disrespect will not produce the reactions they expect. But there is still one final layer of this subject that many overlook. A deeper form of disrespect, one that does not come from others. It comes from yourself. And until that internal dynamic changes, every external strategy will remain incomplete. Because the deepest form of disrespect most people experience is not delivered by strangers, co-workers, or even difficult personalities in their lives. It is delivered quietly through their own tolerance of patterns they know are wrong. It happens the moment you agree to something you already resent. It happens when you stay silent even though a clear line has been crossed. It happens when you pretend a behavior does not bother you simply to avoid discomfort in the room. And each time it happens, something subtle occurs inside your mind. You register the compromise. Not consciously, perhaps, but somewhere deeper. The signal is recorded. You told yourself something mattered, yet your behavior suggested it did not. And over time, those small contradictions accumulate into a quiet erosion of self-trust. You begin doubting your own instincts. You hesitate before asserting your preferences. You analyze situations endlessly instead of responding directly. That hesitation becomes visible. Listen carefully. Other people sense uncertainty faster than they understand explanations. You may speak calmly. You may choose polite words. But if your internal conviction is fractured, the signal travels through tone, posture, timing. Humans are remarkably skilled at detecting these signals even when they cannot describe them. And once the signal appears repeatedly, people begin adjusting their behavior toward you in ways that mirror it. Think about the moments when you knew immediately that something felt wrong. Perhaps a comment crossed the line into mockery. Perhaps someone dismissed your effort publicly while expecting you to laugh along. Perhaps a friend used your patience as a reason to keep taking more from the relationship without reciprocating. In those moments, your intuition spoke clearly. Yet many people override that voice. They tell themselves they are being too sensitive. They rationalize the behavior as stress or misunderstanding. They choose silence because confrontation feels uncomfortable. At first, that silence appears harmless, but internally the signal remains. You notice something, and you ignored it. The next time the situation appears, the voice inside you becomes slightly quieter, not because the situation improved, but because your mind remembers the previous compromise. Eventually, the pattern becomes familiar. The discomfort fades. but not because the behavior stopped, because you adapted to it. That is how self-disrespect forms. Not through dramatic decisions, through repeated small allowances that slowly redefine what you accept. Now here is the paradox. Once a person begins respecting their own boundaries consistently, external disrespect becomes much easier to manage, because the decision about what is acceptable has already been made internally. There is no long internal debate about whether a behavior deserves a response. The signal appears, and the response follows naturally. Measured. Sample. Imagine someone speaking over you again during a conversation. If you already decided that interruptions are unacceptable in your interactions, the correction comes easily. Let me finish. There is no emotional struggle behind the words. You are not negotiating with yourself about whether the boundary is justified. The decision was made long before the moment arrived. That internal clarity changes everything, because people sense when a response comes from conviction rather than impulse. Conviction has a different energy. It does not need volume. It does not need aggression. It simply remains steady. Most people who struggle with disrespect are not lacking intelligence or social awareness. They are lacking internal alignment. Part of them believes they deserve respect. Another part fears losing approval if they enforce it. Those two impulses pull in opposite directions, creating hesitation. And hesitation invites pressure. When someone sees that a boundary might collapse under enough social friction, they may push slightly harder, not always intentionally, sometimes instinctively, because human interaction constantly explores the edges of what is possible. But when someone senses that the boundary is stable, the exploration stops quickly. Not because the person across from them became aggressive, because the environment around that person feels different. Stable, predictable, difficult to move. That stability does not require perfection. You do not need flawless composure or constant strategic awareness. It simply requires one principle that remains consistent. You do not tolerate patterns that diminish your position. Notice the word patterns. Every human interaction contains occasional friction. People interrupt each other accidentally. Jokes sometimes land poorly. Stress produces careless remarks. Responding to every small moment with rigid enforcement would create unnecessary tension in every relationship. That is not strength. That is insecurity disguised as control. What matters is repetition. When the same behavior appears again and again, the pattern becomes clear. And once the pattern becomes clear, your response must also become clear. Not dramatic. Definitive. That distinction separates people who maintain respect from those who constantly chase it. Now consider another important truth. Respect does not mean everyone will admire you. In fact, when someone becomes consistent with their boundaries, admiration is rarely the first reaction they receive. The first reaction is often adjustment. People who were accustomed to easy access must recalibrate their expectations. Conversations may feel slightly more measured. Invitations may become more intentional. Certain dynamics disappear entirely. At first, this can feel strange. You may notice that some people speak to you differently than before. Some become more polite. Some become slightly more cautious. Others may interact with you less frequently. These changes are not signs that something went wrong. They are signs that the signal changed. Think about how social systems operate. Every environment contains invisible agreements about how people treat each other. These agreements are not written down. They emerge from repeated behavior. When one person changes their behavior consistently, the agreement begins shifting. Some participants accept the new terms. Some quietly withdraw. Some attempt to restore the old dynamic. And some discover that they respect the new structure more than they expected. This process can feel uncomfortable if you are used to maintaining harmony by adapting constantly. But harmony built on imbalance is fragile. It requires continuous compromise from one side, while the other side remains unchanged. Once that compromise stops, the relationship must reorganize itself. Sometimes the result is stronger than before, because now both people understand the structure clearly. But sometimes the result is distance, and that distance reveals something important. Some connections existed only because your boundaries were flexible enough to accommodate them. When the flexibility disappears, so does the connection. This realization can feel painful at first. Humans are wired to maintain social bonds. Losing access to familiar dynamics creates uncertainty. But over time, another effect appears. The relationships that remain often become calmer, more balanced, less performative, because everyone involved understands the limits. There is less guessing, less silent resentment, less manipulation hidden inside politeness. Instead, there is clarity. And clarity reduces friction far more effectively than endless accommodation ever could. Now return to the original question. What should you do when someone disrespects you? Most people expect the answer to involve clever comebacks, strategic dominance, or emotional detachment. They imagine a perfect line delivered in the right moment that immediately restores their status. But real power rarely works through theatrical moments. It works through consistency. When disrespect appears, you pause. You observe whether it is accidental or part of a pattern. If it is accidental, you move forward calmly. If it becomes a pattern, you adjust your behavior. You correct the moment when necessary. You withdraw attention when the dynamic becomes unproductive. You enforce boundaries through action rather than speeches. And most importantly, you stop negotiating with yourself about whether your dignity deserves protection. Because once that internal negotiation ends, the rest becomes surprisingly simple. People quickly learn which dynamics are available around you and which are not. Some will test the line once or twice. Most will stop when the response remains calm and consistent. And gradually the atmosphere around you changes. Not dramatically, quietly. The jokes at your expense become rarer. Interruptions become less frequent. Conversations become slightly more respectful. And the strange part is that nobody announces the change. It simply appears, as if the environment itself adjusted its posture. But remember the warning. This shift does not occur because you forced people to respect you. It occurs because your behavior removed the opportunities that once made disrespect easy. Opportunity disappears. Behavior changes. That is the mechanism most people overlook. Disrespect survives where it encounters little resistance and abundant attention. Remove those two elements, and the behavior loses its foundation. And once the foundation disappears, the entire structure collapses quietly on its own. Which brings us to the final point that very few people understand. Respect is not something you demand from the world. It is something the world gradually recognizes when your behavior becomes difficult to move. Not loud, not aggressive, simply steady. The steady refusal to chase approval. The steady refusal to participate in dynamics that diminish your position. The steady willingness to allow distance rather than tolerate imbalance. These signals accumulate over time, and eventually they produce a reputation that speaks long before you enter the room. People begin expecting certain things from you. Clarity, limits. Not because you explained them repeatedly, because your behavior demonstrated them consistently. And when someone eventually considers crossing those limits, something happens inside their mind before they act. They remember previous interactions. They remember the quiet line that did not move. They remember the absence of emotional chaos when pressure appeared. And in that moment, they make a calculation. Is the attempt worth it? Most of the time, the answer is no. Not because you threatened anyone, because the pattern around you made the outcome predictable. And predictability changes behavior faster than confrontation ever will. So the next time someone attempts to dismiss you, interrupt you, or reduce your presence with a casual remark, resist the instinct to defend yourself immediately. Observe the moment. Notice whether it is a single impulse or the beginning of a pattern. Then respond with the calm clarity that comes from internal alignment. Correct when necessary. Withdraw when appropriate. Maintain composure always. Because the goal is not to win every interaction. The goal is to build a presence that does not require constant defense. Once that presence exists, the environment begins adjusting on its own. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the people around you begin treating you differently. Not because you demanded respect, because your behavior made disrespect impractical.